Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream chat. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how the Western bodies politic, how our Western politicians gradually became disconnected from the voters and from the citizens and from the local populace. I think today there's few who would dispute that the political elites of the West have effectively nothing in common at all, share nothing, each having suspicion and contempt for the other, but the political elite care nothing and share nothing, and they are completely disconnected from the local population now and the local voters. Now, how can this possibly occur? The voters give these people their power, that they are there to represent the voter, that is their job description. So it's almost inconceivable that this disconnect could take place, yet here we are, yet it's happened. So let's explore this, how it happened. And again, it didn't happen overnight. It took time. So let's explore that. Now, when you're looking at taking power from a democracy where the power, ostensibly at least, lies with the people and the institutions such as the independent courts of law and so on, when you're trying to take power, there's a few ways of doing it. One is you can do it at the point of a gun, so some sort of revolution. The other is that you take over the smaller institutions from the very outside and then start moving inwards towards the centre where the real power, the real head of power lies. Or you can go for the head of power or something close to it. So what I think happened, or what did happen, was there was a general agreement through the 1970s and into the 1980s. There was a general agreement to shut down the political marketplace. So there would no longer be opposition parties in Parliament with different policies and different ideas. They would all come onto the same page, would all have and share the same policies. They all believe in mass immigration, for example. They all believe in accusing white people of being fascists and Nazis and racists and bigots and so on. So they're really completely on the same page. Now, there are small micro differences that they try and play around with. Some will say that every government department should be headed by a black lesbian, whereas the other party might say, well, no, it should be two black lesbians. And so you get those micro differences, but they play around with transgender bathrooms and things like that. But they're effectively, the entire body politic is on the same page and pursuing all the same objectives. Coincidentally, these objectives happen to be the same as the globalists are pushing. So clearly power was taken over by the globalists, and how they did it was twofold, and this is where the disconnect sort of unfolded step by step. Firstly is they infiltrated media, and the results weren't immediate there. What didn't happen straight away, but they infiltrated the media with cadet journalists and so on that had left-wing views. They infiltrated universities so they could pump out a whole bunch of Western-hating, white-hating activists, and they particularly focused on fringe groups, gay, lesbian, and they used gender studies and peace studies and African American studies to play that card. But in the first instance, to infiltrate the body politic, instead of going straight for the parliament itself, they went for the party administration. So the Democratic Party administration in the United States, or the Labor Party downtown central office in places like Britain and Australia, Canada, and they took over that. Now, those aren't elected officers, they're appointed officials, they're fundraisers, and they're people who decide who stands for election in the various electoral districts. So they went there first. That was one of the first stop-off points at the political level, at least. So they took over the party administration, and so they were able to then select candidates for the local, for the elections, whether it be a regional or a federal or a state election, the United States Federal Congress or the Australian Federal Parliament, that sort of thing. So they're able to select these candidates. Now, first off, they seeded the parties of the left, given they were technically at least sympathetic to the path clearing. So that what the globalists did first was want to clear the path for globalism. And to do that, left-wing politics were particularly helpful because they're the politics of division, eroding confidence, creating conflict. They do all those sorts of things. So the politics of the left were more helpful to clearing that path ahead for the globalists to implement their tyrannical type policies. And the left has always been good for that because they demand total conformity to an ideology and rather than individual liberty. So this was where the left was more useful to the globalists than, say, the political right would have been. Political right, of course, standing more for personal liberty and personal accountability and so on. That wouldn't work for the globalists. They had to go down the path of the left. Now, the left will be discarded later, but right now they're useful for what the globalists want, and they certainly were then. So they first went into the parties of the left and were picking candidates for election. So if say a candidate retired, for example, then they could replace them with effectively a globalist chosen candidate. And then the globalists could arrange proper funding for them so that they would receive political donations, things like that, to help them in their electoral campaign. And you see this even today with George Soros funded fronts that are, say, funding the election of radical district attorneys and even candidates for mayor and for candidates for state governor and attorneys general and so on. So that's going on today. But that's where it began. So they could not on one side, they could decide the candidates that would replace retiring candidates. On top of that, they could also move a propaganda machine. So if they were to target political operatives, political candidates who they didn't like. So say somebody was dead set against, for example, globalisation and the things that went with it, or they were against mass immigration, then the propaganda machine could swing into action and find that they'd engaged in financial irregularities, or suddenly a frail little waif of a woman would appear with a torn blouse. He tried to rape me, and then that would they could just remove people they wanted through public shaming and through just setups like that. So they would then leave politics, and then the candidate could be put in place. So gradually over time, they replaced pretty much all the parliaments with either people who were totally on board with the globalist project or were too stupid to know they were being used as pawns to further the globalist project, or people who were so intimidated and scared by what might happen if they didn't toe the line that they just went along with it, or people they were just bribing outright. And there's a lot of that going on. There's politicians that buy a property worth $1 million and then a Chinese investor will appear and pay $10 million for it, way above market price. And this happens a few times before I know it, that politician is doing very, very nicely, thank you. But they're also the same politician that are heading up various committees to approve international funding coming into the West, or to approve mass migration and things like that. So some of these people are being handsomely rewarded for selling out their own citizens. So that process was moving. Now, running in parallel to that were a number of other things at the same time. And these globalists have played a fairly long game and done, a passably decent job of it. They probably didn't expect our own politicians, Western white politicians, to roll over quite as easily and as quickly as they did. But look, they had this was their plan, and it turned out for them at least rather well. I think better than they'd expected. But at the same time, the media companies, the media laws were changing. Now, they were changing for a number of reasons. The internet in particular was a big game changer. And what it meant was that the news stations could no longer have a complete control over breaking news that was factual. That the factual news could come to your computer in your lounge room, or today your smartphone, and that meant that the value of delivering, the facts, the volcano that exploded, or the assassination this, or the so and so that, those sorts of the leading edge, just breaking news, they no longer had control of that. So the business model had to change from news, factual news, to something else, and they switched it then to well, how can we tell stories that are engaging? How can we create a narrative that's engaging? And that's when you saw a fundamental change in what news was being delivered. So even though it was still called the news, and really it morphed into sort of current affairs infotainment, but instead of talking facts and again talking those groundbreaking facts and news, the just breaking thing, they switched to narratives, so creating a social narrative around it. This was particularly important if they're going to keep a female audience, because the male audience was drifting away to the internet. So to keep a female audience, or to keep say the black audience and that sort of thing, they started using these wow factor narratives. And of course, the best way to do it: did you know you live in a racist country surrounded by evil white people? And so that they switched to, did you know that there's a rapist, girls? There's a rapist around every corner. And so they went to this socially divisive and the stories and the narrative that created social division. They moved. That was the path they went down as a business model. So it's very easy for that business model of a story and a narrative, because again they couldn't report facts anymore. There just wasn't any mileage in it for them. So they then went down the path of a narrative. So it crossed over into storytelling and entertainment, what hitherto had been the news. And that's when, as a business model, it was no longer viable in terms of bringing advertisers in. And so the various organisations bought up the media, who were involved in entertainment or involved in high tech, like AT&T, for example. They bought I think it was CNN, or was it CNBC? Off the top of my head, I can't remember now. But so various big organisations and entertainment organisations were buying up these news outlets, or newspapers for that matter. Newspapers were no longer viable. Most of their revenue came from adverts, particularly things like employment adverts, which were now online. And an employment advert that would have cost, say, $5,000 in a newspaper, you could post for $100 online. So that changed the revenue stream, and again moved the newspapers and the TV stations away from reporting facts and the discipline of finance, so, and going into this fantasy story sort of thing. So they just create a headline and then manufacture a story to go behind it. And so when these business interests bought all the news stuff, the entire media landscape was bought up. I don't think there's any independent, other than maybe a small regional newspaper, and even then, I don't think there's any independent media left across the entire Western world. They're all hostage to what now is the globalist narrative. So they went from facts to a story type narrative, and then into the globalist narrative. So that was the thing there. Now, what that means is, as long as politicians follow the globalist agenda, they'll receive no criticism, only praise, and they'll receive full support from the media. Not only that, the media will create incidents and create headlines, create situations, create storylines that support the globalist agenda, and hence support these politicians. So, I mean, how many stories did you see that ever criticised Obama? And he was the cheerleading poster boy of globalisation, and had, other than some stories on Fox News. And Obama seemed almost mystified. How is it possible that there's anyone left in the world to criticise me or to ask hard questions about the things I do? He just didn't seem to understand it, because the entire media landscape cheered him on, no matter how dumb and crazy and fucked up his policies were. So this is how it all sort of went in parallel. Now, if politicians have no media criticism, and all the politicians around them share the same policies, and there's no opposition party to criticise their policies, or to criticise, you know, the extremities of it in some minor detail, and they'll pretend to quibble over, you know, is it potato or potato? They'll pretend to fight to the death over that, but they won't argue over mass immigration. They won't stop any of the globalist policies. That's just, they just don't argue over that or disagree over it. And if they do disagree, it's by the tiniest increments. You know, we'll have a million immigrants, illegal immigrants coming a year, and that's fine. Oh yeah, well, we're going to get tough. 999,000 for us, and they'll do that silly sort of bickering. But that's just for public spectacle. So this is the thing. So now when you look at politicians, they've got no other politicians to argue with them or point out the failure of their policies or how their policies are bad for the country. So that doesn't exist anymore. Remember, the political market has been shut down, and they have no media criticism or no media attempt to expose the idiocy of the policies or how these policies hurt the local population. That's not discussed. And also the various institutions that would also, the think tanks and public policy sort of watchdogs, all these sorts of things that would also criticise or point out the failure of policies or how, again, they were hurting the local population. All those have been infiltrated as well. So they no longer have an independent voice. Now, the last thing, of course, was the courts. A lot of the courts would overturn some of these pro-globalist and you know, globalist designed policies because they're unconstitutional and all sorts of reasons. But they also have been largely, not completely yet, but largely infiltrated, and also the Department of Prosecutions and public defenders and district attorneys, they also have been heavily infiltrated again. You know, an example being the Soros-funded people that are being installed around the United States. So what happens if a matter goes to court that again would overturn or impede or somehow threaten the globalist policy, it can be arranged that a very tame, agreeable pro-globalist judge can be arranged to hear that case. So really it's the top to bottom there. Now, when you take away all of those, you take away all that accountability. There's no accountability for politicians left. As long as they toe the globalist line and do what they're told by their globalist masters, they'll have a dream run. They'll receive no criticism. They'll receive no condemnation. No one's going to denounce their policies or their vote or their attitudes. They're just going to have a nice run. Their re-elections, they can stay in parliament for as long as they want if they're doing what the globalists tell them to do. Their election campaigns will be generously funded. They're going to receive all sorts of goodies from the globalist, particularly from, say, the big banks and financial institutions. They're going to find that the house they want to sell is going to sell for 10 times the market price. Wow, who would have thought? And all these little goodies and favours and kickbacks and so on, they're going to be well looked after. They're going to have a life of wealth and riches, comfort. And so why wouldn't they do that? Why push against that? Even if the thought would enter their mind, why would they do it? So that's how the disconnect's taken place. But it illustrates to us, I think, that without a fully free and independent media, a fully free and independent bevy of institutions such as public policy think tanks and the like, without opposition parties putting forward policies to actually win the vote of the electorate. Now they just go to the electorate and say, well, those other guys are the damn racist bigots, vote for us. And they go, no, they're the bigger damn racist bigots. And there's no fucking policy in sight. There's just all bullshit of social division, and you know, they're all bigots and this and that. The next thing, we're going to do something about those damn white supremacists, so vote for us. It's all crap. Instead of being accountable for the policies and to the population, the political elite have become completely disconnected for the reasons that I've mentioned there. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.